For the last several days, we've focused in on the matter cycles and looked at how matter can get recycled within the environments with which we live. Now what I want to do is focus in on the climate that affects living organisms and the community interactions that exist in different areas across the world. And so the essential question we want you to think about is what factors contribute to the global climate and how does competition shape communities? And so in your packet, I want you to start taking notes on weather versus climate in Chapter 4, Section 1. I think most of us probably have a pretty good idea of what the weather is. If I were to ask you what is the weather like today, you'd look outside the window and see what's happening. It's the day-to-day conditions and other environmental factors that are happening, like changes that are happening quickly, like one day it might be clear and sunny, and the next day it might be cold and rainy. It's describing what's happening each and every day. Versus the climate is something that's defined by the year after year patterns that exist due to temperature and precipitation. So we're looking at average conditions over long periods of time. For example, when you try to figure out where you're going to go on spring break, we want to get away from the cold winter that we've had here in Minnesota. So we start looking at the average conditions in different areas to try to find somewhere warm to go. That would be looking at the climate. Some other factors that affect the climate would be the greenhouse effect. You have probably talked about this in several of your classes in middle school and probably even some in high school. If you think about the elements we were just talking about within the matter cycles, we were talking about carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. All of these play a part in greenhouse gases. And the greenhouse effect basically allows light to enter our planet, but the greenhouse gases like methane, carbon dioxide, and water vapor trap the heat. And as a result, it's starting to warm up our planet. And so as the greenhouse gases increase, more heat is trapped in the earth and it heats it up. If the concentration of those gases were to fall, more heat would actually be able to escape our planet and the earth would cool. Some scientists have said without the greenhouse gases effect, the earth would be as much as 30 degrees cooler. And so it gets you thinking about how all of these gases we have talked about pass in and out of our atmosphere as a result of all those nutrient cycles we've discussed for the past couple of days. And so another factor that affects climate would be where you live in terms of your latitude and how much energy you're getting from the sun. That's what we mean by solar energy. The sun can hit the earth at different points because our earth is tilted on its axis. If you look at this picture here, the earth is tilted at about a 23.5 degree angle. And so if the sun were over here on the left-hand side of this screen and the earth was tilted away like it is, the most direct rays of sun would hit the bottom part of the earth and not as many direct rays of sun would hit the top. This is what happens in the winter time for us because we're in the northern hemisphere tilted away, and as a result, the temperatures cool. In the summertime, when the earth is around the other side of the sun, we're tilted towards the sun, get more direct rays, and as a result, it heats up the planet. So tropical regions get the more direct sunlight all year long, and as a result have the highest primary productivity, meaning plants are able to produce as much food as they need and carry out photosynthesis and create lots of biodiversity as a result, whereas areas closer to the polar regions have a much greater fluctuation in sunlight and the amount that they get. And besides the latitude of where an organism might live, one of the other things that can affect climate are wind and ocean currents. It's the unequal distribution of heat across the globe that creates wind and ocean currents. And so these currents are the result of areas heating up and cooling down, how the earth is rotating and spinning on its axis, and any other geographical features that might play a part, whether there's mountains that are there, whether we're talking about coastal areas that have the water close to it or something further away. All of these affect the climate in a given area. And so wind is really just the result of air moving as a result of pressure differences. If you've ever watched the meteorologist on TV, they talk about an area of high pressure or low pressure moving into an area. It's just a big air mass that has a difference in pressure. And when those air masses meet, wind occurs. It's just air moving from one air mass to the other. And then it's usually windy for about a day, and then it passes. So those changes can certainly affect what a climate is like. And so ecologists look at the climate to see how that might affect a population or a community. And then they also look at how organisms might interact within those communities. And so one of the terms that is discussed quite a bit by ecologists is a niche or niche. Both pronunciations are correct. It's kind of just like tomato versus tomato. What do you like to say? And so a niche is a range of physical and biological conditions where species live and obtain food to survive and reproduce. And so we're looking at how the amount of food is available to an organism, what the temperature is like in that area, to see whether or not the species will be able to live in a certain area and be successful. A niche is also considered an organism's role in the environment. Much like you have a role in your house with your family, you have certain jobs to do. Your parents might ask you to unload the dishwasher or do the laundry or clean up the food after a meal. Those are your jobs that you have, maybe mowing the yard. A niche is like an occupation to an organism in the wild. That organism needs to do certain things in order to make a living. And so an example of this that we have would be this organism that's pictured here, the paca. It lives in the tropical regions in the Amazon rainforest, and it survives because it has the ability to search out and eat roots and seeds, leaves, flowers, all of these different things. But what is its role? What is its job? To disperse these seeds. It picks these up and carries them to different parts of the rainforest to allow trees to grow and shrubs and flowers to grow. And so the forest depends upon this animal in order to disperse those seeds within the area in which they live. Which brings up another term that is sometimes used incorrectly, an organism's habitat. Some people might use the word niche as the habitat. Remember, a niche is the role. What job does an organism do? Versus a habitat is simply just stating where an organism lives. And an organism picks a spot to live because they can tolerate that area. For example, some people can't tolerate the cold conditions here in Minnesota, and so they move further south to a warmer environment. Temperature plays a big role in why organisms choose to live where they live. If an alligator came up here to Minnesota, it would literally freeze to death because it can't stay warm. Thus, they live in areas down south where it's warmer all year. And so, again, to kind of go back to the previous slide, organisms choose their habitat based on the conditions that are there. Every organism can only tolerate a certain range of conditions. And so tolerance is described as the ability to survive and reproduce under a range of environmental circumstances. And so I chose these pictures because number one, I thought they were kind of funny, but number two, it shows how one organism is tolerant of another. And if one organism needs help, another can certainly do that. The picture on the left probably doesn't happen very often, but perhaps this deer was injured and the dog was trying to help it. The picture on the right is probably just more farm animals, and the dog must have a friend in that pony and is helping him along the way. here is a more practical example of tolerance. Many species that choose to live in the same habitat have figured out how to do so because they are tolerant of one another. You look at all of these different species of birds, they all want to be in the same area. However, they can do that because they all eat different organisms. Their food sources are different. They're all found in perhaps water or near water, but all of these organisms, if you look closely, eat different foods. And so it's kind of interesting to see a picture like this and realize they're all tolerant of one another. But if one of them goes out of their zone, I'm sure they are quickly reminded that they need to go back to their area. And so all species that live in the same habitat will always have some differences that allow them to avoid competition. And so tolerance, again, is an organism's experience stress when they are outside their optimum range. We all could probably sit here and give examples of when we feel stressed. You can probably do a little bit of homework each night and feel okay, but if all of a sudden you have 30 to 40 minutes of homework in all 6 of your classes, you're going to start to feel overwhelmed. And so animals experience stress too when they are asked to do more or have environmental conditions change quickly, and they may not be able to adjust to them in the manner that their body needs them to. Remember, homeostasis is one of the characteristics of life, and if an organism expends a ton of energy to try to maintain that, they're not going to have energy to do other things. And so this graph here is just showing or trying to show that if something changes in the environment where a food source becomes really low, or maybe a temperature changes and it becomes really high, organisms are going to reach their tolerance limit, and then they're going to start to become stressed, and that's going to affect their livelihood and maybe their ability to survive. And so an example of this would be buying a fish. I've had a couple of students share with me that they have bought fish this year. If you owned a tropical fish, here's a few things you may want to consider. Do you have a tank set up at home that has the right water temperature? Because if you put a fish in some water that's too hot or too cold, they may not survive. Do they have enough oxygen in there? And also, do you have the right amount of salt? Salinity refers to the amount of salt in a water environment, and some fish need fresh water where others need salt water. So all of the environmental conditions must be met in order for these organisms to live and survive.